Upper Peninsula, Michigan, October, 1872. The air, smelling of pine and damp earth, carried the first real threat of winter. In the small logging settlement carved from the wilderness, men were splitting a season's worth of firewood, chinking walls with mud and moss, and banking their foundations against the coming freeze, all except one. Inside Matěj Kovář's newly raised cabin, something strange was taking shape. It was not a wall, not a hearth, not a piece of furniture. It was all three at once, a monstrous assembly of fieldstone, clay, and expensive fire brick that consumed nearly a quarter of the single room. It rose from the floor, a blocky, tiered beast of masonry that narrowed as it approached the ceiling. Neighbors, stopping by on the pretense of borrowing a tool or sharing news, would stand in the doorway and stare, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. "What in God's name is it, Kovář?" asked Silas Borden, the sawmill foreman. Borden was a practical man, a man who understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of timber and tonnage. He saw the world in board feet and straight lines. Matěj's creation was an affront to his sense of efficiency. Matěj, a quiet man with hands stained the color of rust and clay, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. He gestured with his trowel. "Is stove," he said, his bohemian accent thick, "and bed." He pointed to a recessed alcove built into the side of the masonry mass, about waist high. It was a stone shelf, 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, just large enough for a man to lie down. Borden let out a short, sharp laugh. Jebediah Stone and Lars Svensson, 2 loggers with him, chuckled along. "A bed?" Borden's voice dripped with incredulity. "You've built your bed inside the stove? It looks more like a coffin, man. A brick coffin. It's the damnedest, most foolish waste of space I've ever seen." The word spread through the settlement as fast as fire in dry slash. Kovář, the greenhorn from the old country, was building a tomb in his own house. He was either crazy or a fool, and on the unforgiving shore of Lake Superior, there was little difference between the two. The mockery was relentless but quiet. Men would nod to him, a slight smirk on their faces. Women would whisper as his wife, Anka, passed by with their 2 small children, the foolish bohemian and his stone coffin. What did this bohemian tile stove mason, a man from a land of ancient cities and deep forests, understand about the physics of thermal mass that the most experienced builders and frontiersmen in Michigan's North Woods had missed? Before we unpack the science of how a stone bed can hold the memory of a fire long after it has died, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We explore the lost wisdom of forgotten innovators, and I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand the profound difference between burning fuel and harvesting warmth. And let us know in the comments, what's the most clever solution you've ever seen for staying warm in the cold? Matěj Kovář was not a logger. He was not a farmer, a carpenter, or a trapper. He had arrived in America with little more than a set of strange, specialized trowels and a deep, instinctual knowledge passed down through generations. In Bohemia, he had been a kamnaz, a master builder of kachalofen, massive, elegant ceramic tile stoves that were the thermal hearts of homes, castles, and farmhouses. His hands didn't know the feel of an axe handle as well as they knew the precise texture of fire clay, the heft of a soapstone block, the delicate curve of a glazed tile. His world was one of flues, baffles, heat exchangers, and combustion chambers. He understood that fire was a wild, fleeting thing, and the only way to tame it was not to contain its light, but to capture its soul in the dense, patient embrace of stone. His family's first winter in the Upper Peninsula, in a poorly constructed shack rented from the logging company, had been a brutal education. That winter, the cold was not a force outside the walls. It was a presence inside the room. Matěj remembered waking to the sight of his own breath misting in the air, the wool blankets on their bed stiff with a creeping layer of frost that had crept in from the edges. He remembered the basin of wash water by the door, frozen solid by morning, a disk of ice that had to be shattered to be removed. His boots, left by the hearth of the small, ravenous cast-iron stove, were often frozen stiff, the leather as hard as wood. The stove was a tyrant. It demanded constant feeding, roaring to life and turning a small circle of the room into a scorching purgatory, while 6 feet away, the cold held its ground. It burned through a cord of wood in 2 weeks, a monstrous appetite that yielded only a temporary, localized truce with the winter. For his wife, Anka, and their children, Jan and Zofia, it was a season of misery. The children were always bundled, their play confined to the small, scorched floorboards directly in front of the stove. Anka's hands were cracked and raw from the constant cycle of heat and cold. That winter, Maciej didn't just feel the cold in his bones. He felt it as a personal, professional failure. He, a master of heat, was being defeated by a crude iron box and thin pine walls. He swore he would not face another winter like it. He would not fight the Michigan cold with the flimsy weapons of the New World. He would fight it with the ancient, patient wisdom of the old. He would build a machine for storing summer. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of effort, but a failure of understanding. The settlers of the Upper Peninsula were masters of wood. They could raise a cabin in a week, felling, notching, and fitting logs with an efficiency that was a marvel of craft. Silas Borden's own home was a testament to this, with tight dovetail notches and a carefully laid stone foundation. Yet even his family shivered through the deep winter. The problem wasn't the structure. The problem was the engine of heat at its center. The cast-iron American stove, a potbelly, a Franklin, or a simple box stove, was a miracle of the industrial age. It was cheap, portable, and could be brought to a roaring heat in minutes. But it was a profound thermal mistake. It operated on the principle of radiant and convective heat. The iron, with a low specific heat capacity, would get incredibly hot, often glowing cherry red. It radiated intense heat in a direct line, scorching anything too close. It also superheated the air around it, which would then rise to the ceiling, creating a powerful convective loop. This hot air would find every tiny crack in the cabin's ceiling and walls and leak out into the frozen world, while simultaneously pulling in drafts of frigid replacement air from below. The result was a room of extreme thermal stratification. A man standing directly beside the stove might have his face burning at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, while the floor by his feet was 40 degrees. The air at the peak of the roof could be 90 degrees, while the corners of the room, where the children slept, hovered just above freezing. The stove created a hot circle, a small island of comfort in a sea of cold. To keep this circle alive required a furious, non-stop consumption of fuel. A typical family would burn through 15 to 20 cords of hardwood in a single winter. A staggering amount of labor translated into fleeting, inefficient warmth. The fire was a flash of lightning, brilliant, hot, and instantly gone. The moment the flames died down, the iron cooled rapidly, and the cabin's temperature would plummet, racing the outside temperature towards zero. The settlers weren't warming their homes. They were merely holding the cold at bay, hour by hour, log by log. They were in a constant losing battle against the laws of thermodynamics. So when Matěj Kovář began his work in September, he was not merely building a stove. He was building a fundamentally different argument about the nature of heat. He started with a deep foundation of sand and packed earth, a thermal break from the frozen ground. Upon this, he began to lay courses of local fieldstone, mortared with a special mix of clay, sand, and lime he prepared himself. The outer walls of the structure rose slowly, thick and solid. Silas Borden, watching one afternoon, shook his head. "You're using enough stone for a root cellar, Maciej. It's too slow. Too heavy." Maciej simply nodded, laying another stone. "Must be slow," he said, more to the stone than to Borden. "Heat must walk, not run." Inside the outer shell, he built a small, compact firebox from expensive high-alumina fire brick he'd had shipped from a foundry in Marquette. It was surprisingly small, barely large enough for 2 or 3 split logs. "That little box won't heat a woodshed in July," sneered Jebediah Stone, a man who believed the size of the firebox was a measure of a man's worth. Maciej didn't argue. He just continued his work. The real genius of the structure was invisible, hidden within its mass. From the top of the firebox, he didn't run a straight pipe to the roof. Instead, he constructed a labyrinth of horizontal flue channels that snaked back and forth through the entire structure. The hot gases from the fire, instead of rushing straight up and out the chimney, were forced to take a long, slow, winding journey. They traveled the length of the stove, then dropped down a level, traveled back the other way, and dropped again. The flue path was over 30 feet long, all contained within the masonry block. This was the part that baffled everyone. It violated every principle of chimney design they knew. A good chimney needed a strong, straight draft. Maciej's design seemed engineered to choke the fire. "It'll never draw," Lars Svensson declared, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "You'll fill your cabin with smoke before you get a flame to catch." Finally, he began to construct the sleeping platform. It was a thick slab of carefully chosen soapstone, laid over the topmost flue channel. The hot gases would make their final pass directly beneath the bed, before finally exiting into a small chimney pipe. This was the feature that earned it the name Coffin. It was an act of madness. Anka watched him, her expression a mix of wifely trust and practical concern. "Maciej, are you sure?" she asked one evening, touching the cool stone of the alcove. "It feels cold, like a cellar wall." "Is cold now," he said, placing a hand over hers. "Tonight we build first fire. Tomorrow you will prove your bread dough on this stone. It will remember the fire." The total mass of the structure was nearly 4 tons. It had cost him a significant portion of their savings and 2 months of back-breaking labor. As he sealed the final joint, the community had reached its verdict. It was Kovář's folly, a monument to old-world ignorance. "A place to sleep," Borden joked down at the sawmill, from which a man might never wake up. They laughed, but the laughter was edged with the nervous anxiety of men who knew that a single mistake, a single foolish decision, could mean death in the coming winter. To understand the revolution taking place inside Maciej Kovář's cabin, one has to understand the simple but profound principle of thermal mass. Thermal mass is an object's ability to store heat. Think of it like a battery, but for thermal energy instead of electricity. The key factors are the material's density and its specific heat capacity, the amount of energy required to raise its temperature. Let's compare the two technologies. A typical cast iron pot-belly stove weighed about 200 pounds. Iron has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.45 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Celsius. It heats up incredibly fast, and it cools down just as fast. It's a sprinter. It releases its energy in a brilliant, short burst. To get significant heat, you had to run the stove at a surface temperature of 600 or 700 degrees Fahrenheit, a dangerous and inefficient temperature that incinerated wood, turning much of its potential energy into useless, superheated gas that shot straight out the chimney. The stove stored very few British thermal units, BTUs, in its own mass. It was a conduit, not a container. Now consider Maciej's stove. It was 4 tons, 8,000 pounds, of stone, brick, and mortar. The specific heat capacity of stone and brick is roughly double that of iron, around 0.84 kilojoules per kilogram degree Celsius, So, pound for pound, it could already hold twice the heat. But Matěj had 40 times the pounds. The total heat storage capacity was immense. His strategy was completely different. He would burn a small, very hot fire for just a couple of hours. The firebox, lined with insulating fire brick, would reach temperatures over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, ensuring complete combustion of the wood and gases. This intense heat would then be forced through the 30-foot maze of flue channels. The hot gases, with nowhere to go but through the maze, would spend a long time inside the stove, and the vast, dense mass of the masonry would act like a sponge, slowly absorbing the heat. By the time the exhaust gases finally exited the chimney, they were barely 150 degrees Fahrenheit. All the useful energy, thousands upon thousands of BTUs, had been transferred and stored in the stone. The stove itself became a massive, gentle radiator. Its surface never got dangerously hot, typically staying between 120 and 170 degrees. It didn't heat the air so much as it radiated a steady, low-frequency infrared energy that warmed the objects in the room: the floor, the furniture, the walls, the people. This created a stable, uniform environment, eliminating the hot and cold spots of the iron stove. The problem wasn't a lack of fire. The problem was a failure to store the fire's memory. Maciej's stove was a library of warmth, and he was simply checking out a book of heat to read through the long, cold night. In late January, the sky turned the color of lead, and the wind died. An unnatural stillness fell over the forest. Then, the snow began. It was not a normal storm. It was a lake-effect siege. For 11 days, a relentless torrent of snow poured from the heavens, driven by frigid air passing over the open, warmer waters of Lake Superior. The world vanished beneath a blanket of white. Drifts piled up to the eaves of the cabins. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero, then 20, then held there. Travel became impossible. The settlement was an island, each cabin an island within it. This was the crucible. For the families with iron stoves, it was a waking nightmare. The men could barely keep up. They had to tunnel to their wood piles, hauling in armloads of frozen timber that seemed to be consumed by the stoves as fast as it was loaded. The fires roared day and night. Inside, life shrank back to that small, familiar circle of heat. Frost painted intricate fern-like patterns on the inside of the window panes. At Silas Borden's house, his wife hung blankets over the doorways to create a smaller living space, abandoning the rest of the cabin to the killing cold. Miles away, at a logging camp on the Escanaba River, Borden and a crew of 5 men were caught by the storm while trying to break up a massive log jam. Their temporary shelter, a crude log bunkhouse with a single potbelly stove, was no match for the siege. The wind knifed through the chinking. The stove, glowing red, devoured wood. Yet the men huddled around it still felt the cold seeping into their bones. Their beards and mustaches were rimmed with ice from their own breath. After 3 days, their situation was becoming desperate. But inside the Kovář cabin, a different reality existed. The world outside had disappeared, but inside, a quiet, steady warmth prevailed. The air was still and pleasant. There were no drafts. Anka moved about the room in a simple dress, her cheeks flushed not with cold, but with the gentle heat from her work. In the morning, Matěj would load the small firebox and let it burn hot and fast for 2 hours. The flames would roar, a contained and efficient fury. Then he would shut the dampers. He would do the same in the evening. For the other 20 hours of the day, there was no fire. There was only the stone, breathing out the heat it had inhaled. The domestic warmth was proven in the small details. Jan and Zofia were not bundled in layers of wool. They sat on a bearskin rug on the floor, playing with carved wooden animals, their fingers nimble, their breath not misting in the air. On the side of the masonry stove, away from the firebox, Anka had placed a large bowl of bread dough to rise. The stone shelf was the perfect temperature, a steady 80 degrees, and the dough swelled beautifully. The smell of yeast filled the warm, stable air. It was a smell of life, of normalcy, a profound defiance of the white wasteland outside. The cold had been so thoroughly defeated that they were not just surviving, they were living. On the 8th day of the siege, Silas Borden made a desperate decision. The bunkhouse was losing the battle, and one of his men, a young French-Canadian named Pierre, was shivering uncontrollably, his face pale. Their main camp was miles away, an impossible journey. The closest light, the closest hope, was the Kovář homestead. Bundling themselves in every layer they had, Borden and his 3 strongest men set out, half carrying Pierre through the chest-deep snow. It was a brutal, soul-sapping trek. They navigated by instinct, fighting for every step. When they finally saw the faint yellow glow from Matěj's window, it was like a lighthouse in a frozen ocean. They stumbled to the door, Borden pounding on it with a numb fist. Matěj opened it, and a wave of calm, gentle warmth washed over them, a physical shock so profound it made them dizzy. They staggered inside, their bodies screaming with the pain of thawing muscles. Borden's first instinct was for the stove. He looked for the roaring, red-hot beast he expected to see, the center of the cabin's life. He saw only the huge, quiet mass of stone. The iron door of the firebox was closed and dark. There was no flicker of light, no roar of flame. "Your fire's out, Kovář," Borden said, his voice raspy with concern and confusion. This level of warmth was impossible without a raging fire. Matěj was helping the men out of their frozen coats. He glanced at the stove. "Since noon," he said quietly. Borden froze. He looked at the simple clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. 12 hours. He felt a prickle of disbelief, a sense that the laws of nature had been suspended in this small room. He walked toward the masonry structure, the one he had mocked, the one he had called a coffin. He saw the recessed sleeping platform, a clean wool blanket folded upon it. He reached out a hand. His mind braced for what he knew he should feel. He expected the clammy, deep-sunk chill of a tombstone in a winter graveyard. Instead, his palm met a solid, living warmth. It was not a harsh, burning heat, but a steady, pervasive radiance. Like lying on a great slab of sun-baked granite at the end of a long summer day, it was impossible. He pressed his entire hand flat against the soapstone, feeling the gentle, relentless flow of energy into his frozen skin. The stone was breathing heat. Just then Charlie, one of the loggers, fumbled with his gear. His soaking wet woolen mittens, caked with snow and ice, fell from his coat and landed on the edge of the stone bed. No one paid them any mind for a minute as Anka handed them mugs of hot broth. But then Borden saw it, a small, ghostly wisp of vapor rising from one of the mittens. Then another. Within minutes, a steady plume of steam was curling up from the wet wool, rising into the warm, still air. They were steaming dry on a stone bed, hours after the fire had died. The sight broke something in Silas Borden. It shattered his certainty, his lifetime of practical, hard-won knowledge. Everything he thought he knew about fire and warmth was wrong. He looked at the massive stone structure, then at Matěj, then back at the steaming mittens. He finally understood. He had seen it as a dead thing, a tomb. He was wrong. It was the most alive thing in the room. He found his voice, but it was quiet, filled with a new kind of respect. "You didn't build a stove, Matěj," he said, the words forming slowly as the revelation crystallized. "You built a harbor." The story of the stranded crew and the night they spent in Kovář's cabin became legend. Silas Borden once the loudest critic, was now Maciej's most fervent advocate. He described the steaming mittens, the steady warmth from the dead fire, the quiet miracle he had witnessed, to anyone who would listen. He spoke with the zeal of a convert, his words carrying the weight of his authority as foreman. He convinced the owners of the logging company that Kovář's design was not folly, but a sound economic investment. The following summer, the company hired Maciej to oversee the construction of massive heated sleeping platforms in their new bunkhouses. The design was simplified for communal living. Long, low benches of stone and brick running the length of the building, heated by a single, large firebox at one end. The men no longer slept in cold, drafty bunks. They slept on a vast, warm surface that held the heat through the night. The results were immediate and dramatic. Fuel consumption for the camps dropped by over 60%. The men were healthier, suffering fewer respiratory illnesses. They slept soundly, waking up warm and rested, and their productivity increased. The idea, proven in the harsh laboratory of the bunkhouses, began to spread. Homesteaders and farmers from across the Upper Peninsula and into Wisconsin came to see Maciej's creation. They took measurements, made sketches, and returned home to build their own versions. The Bohemian stove, or stone bed, began to appear in farmhouses and cabins, a testament to a better way of living with the cold. Matěj Kovář, the foolish greenhorn, was now sought out for his wisdom. He shared his knowledge freely, never asking for payment, content to see families warm and safe. The simple, powerful idea Matěj Kovář brought to the Michigan frontier was a remarkable anticipation of modern building science. A century later, architects and engineers would give his principles new names: radiant heating, passive solar design, thermal mass energy storage. The concept of using dense materials within a building's envelope to absorb and slowly release heat is now a cornerstone of energy-efficient, sustainable construction. What Matěj built with fieldstone and clay is the direct ancestor of modern radiant floor heating systems and tram walls. He didn't have the language of BTUs per pound or specific heat capacity, but he had something more fundamental: a deep, generational understanding of how to make stone and fire work together, not as enemies, but as partners. His Coffin was a high-performance thermal battery, a machine of elegant simplicity that outperformed anything the industrial age had to offer. There is a memory in things. Wood remembers the sun and wind that shaped it. Iron remembers the violent fire of the forge. But stone's memory is the longest and deepest. A flash fire is a shout, a dramatic, energetic burst that is quickly spent and just as quickly forgotten by the air. It leaves no lasting warmth, no lingering story. It is a moment, not a presence. The stone is different. It does not shout. It listens. It absorbs the fire's fierce, brief story, takes that energy into its dense and patient heart, and then tells that story back to the room, not as a shout, but as a long, slow whisper. It holds the warmth long after the flame is ash. It is a library of heat, a reservoir of comfort. The frontier valued the quick, the loud, the powerful, the roar of the saw, the crack of the axe, the blast of the fire. But survival, and eventually comfort, often depended on the quiet, patient, and enduring forces, the qualities of the stone itself. In the heart of the great cold wilderness, Matěj Kovář proved a simple, eternal truth. Stone remembers what flame forgets. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of thermal science and forgotten history valuable, please like this video and subscribe for more stories like it. Let us know in the comments what other historical technologies you'd like to see us explore. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building techniques should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.